You wake up feeling terrible, throat on fire, head pounding, body aching from the inside out. You reach for medicine, call a doctor, check your symptoms online. Now take all of that away, every single bit of it. No medicine, no doctors, no hospitals, no internet, no pharmacies, not even a basic understanding of what germs are. Just you, sick, alone, in the dark, with nothing. If videos like this make you think differently about the world, subscribe right now. Every week, we uncover stories that completely change how you see being human. It takes 2 seconds, and it means everything to a small channel like this. Now back to the story. Because what ancient humans did when they got sick will genuinely shock you. The first thing you need to understand is that ancient humans weren't helpless. They were something far more powerful than that. They were obsessively observant. For hundreds of thousands of years, their survival depended entirely on noticing things. Which animals were dangerous? Which plants were safe to eat? Which weather patterns meant danger was coming? That same obsessive attention to detail eventually turned toward the human body itself. And what they discovered changed medicine forever, even if we forgot to give them credit for it. Imagine you're sitting in a forest 50,000 years ago. The person beside you is burning with fever. Their skin is hot to the touch. Their eyes are glassy. Their breathing is shallow and fast. You don't know what a virus is. You don't know what bacteria are. You don't know what infection means. But you know one thing with absolute certainty. If you don't do something, they will die. So you do what your ancestors taught you. You find a willow tree. You strip the bark. You make them chew it slowly. And then you wait. Within hours, their fever begins to drop. You don't know why it works. You just know that it does. And you will never forget it. Here's the fact that should stop you completely. Willow bark contains a compound called salicin. When the human body processes salicin, it converts it into salicylic acid, the exact same active compound that we eventually isolated, refined, and turned into aspirin. Ancient humans were using aspirin thousands of years before we invented it. They just didn't know what to call it. Ancient Egyptians documented willow bark as medicine over 3,500 years ago. Ancient Greeks used it. Native Americans used it independently on the other side of the planet. Every major ancient civilization on Earth independently discovered the same thing. That tells you something extraordinary. It wasn't luck. It was the result of hundreds of thousands of years of careful human observation. The world's first pharmaceutical research was conducted by people who had never seen a laboratory. But willow bark was just the beginning. Because ancient humans didn't just stumble onto one medicine. They built entire libraries of plant knowledge, passed from generation to generation, long before writing existed. In ancient India, the Ayurvedic medical system documented over 700 medicinal plants. In ancient China, the Shennong Bencao Jing cataloged 365 medicines derived from plants, animals, and minerals. In ancient Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents ever found, listed over 800 medical formulas. 800. Written over 3,500 years ago. These weren't witch doctors making things up. These were careful, methodical practitioners who had spent generations observing what worked and what didn't. The world's first doctors were ancient humans with no schools, no degrees, and no equipment. Just eyes and memory and time. Now here's the moment that will genuinely make your jaw drop. In 1991, hikers in the Alps discovered a frozen body in the ice. They called him Ötzi the Iceman. He was over 5,300 years old. When scientists examined him, they made an extraordinary discovery. Ötzi was carrying a leather pouch. Inside that pouch were medicinal plants, specifically chosen, specifically prepared for the injuries and conditions he was suffering from at the time of his death. 5,300 years ago, a human being had packed their own medical kit with targeted treatments for specific conditions. That is not primitive. That is sophisticated medical thinking, older than every civilization we normally talk about. But plants were only one part of how ancient humans survived illness. There was something else they used, something so simple we almost overlooked it entirely. Something that modern medicine has now confirmed is one of the most powerful healing forces in human biology: each other. When someone in an ancient group became seriously ill, the group didn't leave them behind. They couldn't afford to. Not just emotionally, strategically. Every person in a small ancient tribe represented irreplaceable knowledge. A sick elder carried decades of survival wisdom. A wounded hunter knew patterns of animal migration that kept the group fed. Losing one person wasn't just sad, it was potentially catastrophic. So the group stayed. They kept the fire burning through the night. They brought clean water. They shared food even when food was desperately scarce. They sat beside the sick person and refused to leave. Modern medicine now knows that warmth, hydration, nutrition, and social connection are four of the most critical factors in recovering from illness. Ancient humans figured all four of them out, not through science, through love, through loyalty, through the simple human refusal to abandon someone who needed help. Now here's something that will completely change how you think about ancient medicine. Honey. Ancient humans discovered that honey never goes bad. Ever. Archaeologists excavating Egyptian tombs found honey that was over 3,000 years old. They tasted it. It was still perfectly edible. But the truly extraordinary discovery came later. When scientists tested ancient honey against modern bacteria, they found something almost impossible to believe. Honey killed bacteria more effectively than some modern antibiotics. Ancient humans had discovered nature's perfect antimicrobial agent, thousands of years before we understood what bacteria even were. They packed honey into wounds. They used it to treat burns. They used it to preserve surgical dressings. And it worked, every single time. But the most shocking medical discovery ancient humans ever made happened completely by accident. Ancient Egyptians noticed something strange. When they pressed moldy bread directly onto infected wounds, the infection got better. They had no idea why. They just knew it worked. So they kept doing it. For thousands of years, generation after generation, pressing moldy bread onto wounds, with no understanding of what was actually happening. Then, in 1928, a Scottish scientist named Alexander Fleming looked through a microscope at a contaminated petri dish and discovered penicillin. The mold that ancient Egyptians had been accidentally using 3,000 years earlier was the same mold that would eventually save hundreds of millions of lives. In 2 world wars, in hospitals around the world, in the antibiotic revolution that completely transformed human life expectancy. Ancient Egyptians discovered penicillin 3,000 years before Fleming. They just didn't have a microscope to see what they'd found. Now, let's talk about something that nobody talks about. What happened when the illness wasn't in the body, but in the mind? Because ancient humans got mentally sick too. Anxiety, grief, trauma, depression, psychosis. These aren't modern inventions. They're human experiences as old as humanity itself. And ancient humans developed treatments for them that modern psychology is only now beginning to fully understand. When someone was struggling mentally, the community gathered. Stories were told around the fire. Songs were sung together. Rhythmic drumming was performed for hours. Ceremonies that involved the entire group were designed specifically to make one suffering person feel seen, held, connected. We look at these ancient rituals today and call them superstition. But what they were actually doing was providing three things that modern psychology now identifies as the most powerful treatments for mental illness: social connection, shared meaning, emotional expression. They didn't have therapists. They had something therapists are still trying to recreate: a community that refused to let someone suffer alone. And then there's the part of ancient medicine that shocked modern surgeons when they discovered it: brain surgery. Ancient skulls have been found from multiple continents, with holes deliberately drilled into them using stone tools. Not small holes, full surgical openings in the human skull, performed with nothing but shaped stone. No anesthesia, no sterile environment, no surgical lighting. And here is the fact that stopped modern neurosurgeons in their tracks. The bone had regrown around the openings, which means the patients survived. Not some of them, not occasionally, with survival rates in some ancient populations that reached over 80%. Modern brain surgery, with all our technology, anesthesia, sterile theaters, and imaging equipment, has survival rates that ancient skull surgeons would have found familiar. Think about that. For as long as you need to. They also performed amputations with stone tools. No pain relief beyond whatever plants they had discovered. No sterile environment. No blood transfusions. No antibiotics. And yet, archaeological evidence shows that amputees survived, lived for years after the procedure. Long enough for the bone to show healing and remodeling. Long enough to be cared for by their community. Long enough to contribute knowledge back to the group that saved them. These were not lucky accidents. These were procedures performed with intention, by practitioners who had learned from those who came before them, in an unbroken chain of medical knowledge stretching back further than any written record. For most of human history, survival after serious illness was never guaranteed. A broken bone could become infected and kill you within days. A simple cut in the wrong place could end your life before the week was out. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous events a human could experience. Ancient humans knew all of this. They felt the uncertainty every single time someone they loved got sick. And yet they kept going. They treated the sick, knowing the outcome was uncertain. They passed knowledge forward, knowing they might not survive to use it themselves. They built communities around caring for each other, even when resources were desperately scarce. Even when helping someone sick meant putting yourself at risk. Even when survival would have been easier if they had just walked away. They didn't walk away. That instinct, to help, to heal, to stay, is not something modern medicine invented. It's not something hospitals created. It's not something science discovered. It is something we were born with, something that was already ancient, when the first human reached out to help another. So the next time you take a painkiller without thinking about it, remember the person who first discovered willow bark. When you apply honey to a wound, remember the ancient hands that discovered the same thing thousands of years before you. When you take an antibiotic, remember the Egyptian who pressed moldy bread onto an infected wound with no idea why it might work, and did it anyway. When a doctor sits beside you and refuses to leave until you're stable, remember that this instinct is not a medical protocol. It is 50,000 years old. Every piece of medical knowledge you benefit from today started with someone who noticed something, who remembered it, who told someone else, who sat beside a sick person and refused to leave. If this video made you see ancient humans differently, subscribe. Every week, we uncover one more story that proves our ancestors were far smarter than anyone gives them credit for. You won't want to miss the next one. That's not primitive. That's the foundation everything else was built on. Drop a comment below. Would you have survived without modern medicine? I read every single one.